a designer, and Alison Korn, a designer and almost graduated law student. Is that right?
I'm officially an attorney now.
Okay. Awesome. Another attorney who is designing in the domestic violence restraining order space. Thank you so much. Go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Sid. Everyone can hear me. Can you hear me, Allison? Thanks, everyone can. Hi, everyone. My name is Frances Ho, and as Sid said, I'm an attorney with the Judicial Council of California, which is the policy-making body for our court system in California. And I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you, Sid, for inviting us to talk about the work that we've been doing with our domestic violence restraining order forms. So I've been in the domestic violence field for about 15 years. And during that time, always working within the court system, first helping victims and survivors directly with filling out restraining order applications, the forms that we're going to talk about today. And now I get to do the policy work and geek out on forms with Alison, who I'm going to have introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Alison Korn. I am a legal designer and attorney for ProBonoNet and the Legal Aid Association of California. I also work with Frances at the Judicial Council of California, working on the domestic violence forms. Before law school, I was a graphic designer, and I worked in print publications, designing books. And I got really interested in usability. I knew I always wanted to go back to law school, and am personally interested in the DV space and figuring out ways to make forms more accessible for everyone, so that people can access justice. And we're super excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
Great. So when we're talking about domestic violence victims and survivors, it's really important when we look at forms to really dig into how these forms make them feel. And so what we're focusing on today is to talk about the what we know about re-traumatization, how forms might lessen re-traumatization. That's one thing that Alice and I have been working on. How might we make our forms easier to get through, easier for survivors to tell, maybe for the first time, or to retell their story. And so what we're going to walk you through is just, kind of a really high level, what do we mean by re-traumatization? Tell you and show you what our current request form looks like, at least the part that asks the person to tell their story, how they've been abused, what we did to go about testing out and getting information about how our current form is working, and also on our prototypes. And we'll also show you what we've come up with as where we are in our prototype today. So I'm going to hand it over to Alison to talk about re-traumatization.
Great. So re-traumatization, what does it mean? What does it look like? Re-traumatization occurs when a person re-experiences a previously traumatic event, either consciously or unconsciously. And so some symptoms may be flashbacks, anxiousness or fear, any type of uncomfortable feeling that may show itself. A person may have difficulty concentrating, they may feel tired or fatigued. Just overall intensely negative emotions. They may have an inability to control emotions or strong physical reactions to triggers. And these are all symptoms, again, of what re-traumatization may look like. These aren't all encompassing. Obviously, there are various and numerous ways people may experience trauma or re-traumatization. And so what that looks like in the court form process, I think, is best illustrated by an experience I had. And so while in law school, I was working in a self-help clinic for domestic violence survivors. And I had a woman come in who was experiencing domestic violence and wanted to ask for a restraining order against her husband. And as we sat down and I was walking through the form with her, the current petition that we'll show you here in a second, we got to the part of the form that asks for the person to kind of tell their story in their own words, to write it down. And this person, this woman, was so uncomfortable writing. She just felt very uncomfortable writing it. It was unrelated to the actual trauma that she experienced, but because of her uncomfortability with writing, she started to become very, very anxious and agitated. to the point to where she slammed her fist down on the table and stood up and said, I don't want this. I don't want to do this anymore, and walked out. And I thought that was really telling because to me, in that moment, she decided to walk back into the face of danger, potentially trauma, abuse, rather than fill out a court form in order to ask for a restraining order. And so that was very telling to me in a very visceral way in which re-traumatization, or this person experienced re-traumatization. So I hope that helps illustrate kind of what that may look like for any particular person. So I'm gonna hand it back over to Frances right now. She's gonna talk about the current DD request form.
Thanks, Alison. And I think, that is a great example of, why this matters so much, why it matters that we make this form as accessible and easy to get through for victim survivors as possible. And to give you some context, the domestic violence restraining order process is probably one of the most frequently used processes in California. About 80,000 are filed yearly. And if you need a restraining order against someone you've had an intimate relationship with or someone you're closely related to, this is the restraining order that you're going to file for. And you are required in California to use our forms. And forms, we created forms to provide access to self-represented litigants, but the how becomes so important, right? In these, everybody can still hear me. Alison, do you mind muting maybe when I'm hearing some echo? Thanks so much. So what we do know is we think about 70 to 80% of people that are asking for restraining orders have to go through this process self-represented, meaning they don't have an attorney to help them or to represent them in court. And let's see, I just want to make sure you can see, this is a snapshot. I'm going to give it a sec. Thanks, Alison. This is a snapshot of what the current form looks like when you get to the part that asks you to explain to the judge why you need a restraining order, so the describe abuse section. And these are our plain language forms, but if you can see the text, which is very small at the top, we've dropped statutory language right onto the form. So already we know that there are issues with accessibility, with people understanding what the law means when it says abuse, right? What abuse means under the law. Organizationally, this question is essentially at the end of the form, which can be very hard for people who've already been sitting a couple of hours learning about the process, filling out the other pages of the form. And by the time they get to this section, you kind of get what we refer to as the eyes glazed over look, where they just don't have the capacity anymore. So we knew there was some work to be done there. And the other thing about this, the way this is structured, is that it forces the person to actually start with the most recent event. And people aren't used to telling their story that way. They're not used to going backwards in time, in other words. And so there was some work that we wanted to do there to give people their autonomy to design the form in a way that fits as many people as possible and how they might tell their story. Next slide. And Alison, I think I'm handing it off to you to talk about user testing.
Yeah, thanks, Frances. And so of what we, in that previous slide, were asked, or where it stated, like, what's triggering, obviously, we didn't come up with all that by ourselves. We had to do some user testing in order to determine what was working with the current form and what wasn't. And so we did that through user testing, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now. If my screen will work, there we go. So I want to talk a little bit about the who, what, where, and how of our user testing. So who did we user test? We user test self-represented service providers, attorneys, justice corps members, and judges. So we tried to get a wide just a wide array of folks within the DV space, and so that we could get a very accurate understanding of how people experienced the form from any position from which they were coming. And so we user tested the current DV petition that we just showed you, and then we also, after obtaining findings and data from those user tests, we then incorporated that into a prototype and tested the prototype to ensure that, or rather to test whether our assumptions were correct. Where did we test? We tested prior to the pandemic in court self-help centers. We also had help from service providers within local community organizations who helped test in their facilities, and we also have been testing online since the pandemic, which has been an interesting transition. And then how did we do that? We best accomplished user testing by coming up with a script that we used and that we also provided to folks within the community organizations so that they could work with self-represented litigants or survivors of abuse and run through a testing session with them. We found that sometimes that was the better approach because these people could act as support persons for survivors of abuse, and that added to a level of comfort in order for these people to feel comfortable being vulnerable with their stories. We had one person especially in the online sessions, there were often 3 people. One person acted as the proctor who would conduct the testing session. We would also have a note taker. We've also found that gift cards are really helpful in enticing people to do user testing because oftentimes it's not convenient. It does take up time in your day, so just a little incentive helps people become more interested in doing that user testing. And so I want to talk a little bit about our findings. And so as we did our user testing, I think one of the more telling anecdotes that I can recall, and Francis, you'll have to help supplement here. We were doing user testing with a Justice Corps member who worked in one of the self-help centers, I think in Alameda County. Anyway, so we went through the current DV petition and asked her to go through the petition and act if she wear her self-represented litigant hat, and to tell us what she found confusing or difficult about the form. And as she was going through, she would just point out various things. And she goes, I'm actually fluent in Spanish, and oftentimes I work with folks who only speak Spanish, and I have to explain what all these different legal terms are to them in Spanish. And oftentimes there's not a direct translation for various English legal terms. So like for instance, an order. How do you explain what a judge's order is in Spanish? And she said, there's not a direct translation. And so I asked her, well, how do you explain that? And she says, well, I just tell them that it's the form that the judge signs. And I thought that was such an interesting plain language translation that we could use in English. And so we oftentimes now, or every time rather, ask anyone who is fluent in a different language how they would explain an English legal term of art in a different language. So, Francis, do you have any findings you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, since we're going to be showing you a prototype of the description of abuse section, one of our assumptions going in is that people struggle with telling their story in writing. I think people are just, much more comfortable telling a friend or somebody close to them verbally, right? It's the primary form, the way we communicate primarily. And so not only are people uncomfortable with writing and there's literacy issues and language accessibility, but writing for a judicial audience is also something that's different, right? And our legal system was not designed for them. And so how can we design our form to fill that gap? So I think we can go into our prototype. And our assumption, I think, was correct because what we found when we went on these various site visits is that the helpers actually took the writing component away as that task away from the self-represented litigant. They would have a helper write the person's story for them. So they would have the person tell them what their story is and write it down for them. And I think that was very telling for Alison. And it was certainly for Alison and I, and it was certainly my experience as a provider that it was just easier for me to put their words into writing for them for judicial officers. So it's great when you have a helper, right? But we're designing the forms for somebody who is not going to have access to that helper, is maybe in a rural area and can't get assistance that's 100 miles away and is by themselves and has to fill out our form. So what can we do to make our forms accessible for that person? And so if you can see the screen, I know that the shots are pretty small, but if you can zoom in on them, the first thing that we did was we created checkboxes for people. We thought, if we give them the words, maybe that'll help prime them. Oh, yes, that happened to me. I can check a box. And then there's going to be space for them to provide detail. And this was confirmed when we tested. One survivor noted that it took away the shame of having to write down what happened to her. What we also asked participants, how easy was this to fill out on a scale of 1 through 5, 1 being very easy, 5 being very hard. And we got a lot of 1s and 2s, which was a great sign for us that we were on the right track, or at least not on the wrong track. And it took some survivors as little as 3 minutes to fill out this section, which was amazing to us. I will say, though, that for the survivors where it took just 3 to 5 minutes or a few minutes to fill out this section, they had experienced physical abuse. And that can be sometimes easier to identify than non-physical or emotional abuse. And that's something that we're thinking about and working on. So what you can see on the bottom of the screen here is that we provided some figures. And this is kind of, this idea came about because we thought of what, I think the medical field does, right? A doctor, or even someone that's examining somebody, they have a chart and often they have diagrams and they can just mark on the diagram. And so we had this, we tested this, and we certainly had survivors that were able to use the diagrams to indicate where they had bruises or where they were, if they had a black eye, for example. This probably also helps with language accessibility to being able to circle somewhere where you're injured versus having to write it down in a language that you're, in English, where you may not be fluent. And we also left a space for people to describe any emotional harm or emotional injury that they suffered. And that's something that's currently not on the form. Alison, did you want to add anything to?
Myself. No, I think you actually did a really nice job covering it. And I think, really pointed out that it was very important to us to give survivors of abuse autonomy in telling their story, because they are in situations where their autonomy is taken from them by their. And so if we could figure out a way to lessen the trauma they experience in telling their story, we thought that would accomplish what we were setting out to do. So I think we are heading in the right direction with this prototype. So.
I think I'll just add to a couple of things that we wanted to make sure we did was you didn't see it in the last slide, but we explained what the judge is going to do with this information, why you have to tell the judge what happened to you. And also at the beginning of the form, we're starting to add how long we think it's going to take you. It's going to take you at least an hour to get through this form. And then there's going to be 2 other forms, and it may take you about 15 minutes to get through those 2 other forms, especially for a victim survivor, so that they can prepare if they're having to find a time where it's safe for them to fill out this application. That information is really crucial. And I think we could talk about forms all day, Alison and I. So we'll stick around, I think, and mingle after this. And geek out on forms if anybody wants to.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was tremendous. And we'll send you back to the tables for a little while, and then we'll hear from Quentin Stainhouse. Thank you, Francis and Alison.